For 5 years shy of a century, Disney has defined animation as an art form, with dozens of beautifully crafted films leading its roster of classics. Disney's had their fair share of hits with both traditional hand-drawn animation and computer-generated imagery, and many of their films are breathtaking on both an artistic and technical level. But there was a day when Disney literally gambled all that it had on making the next film more spectacular than the last, topping each film that came before with a new one of unprecedented quality. This era of innovation kept on going for almost an entire decade, until it finally reached its peak with what Walt Disney considered to be the pinnacle of animation as an art form, and certainly the most technically impressive animated film ever made at the time, the masterpiece known as Sleeping Beauty. But why is Sleeping Beauty a masterpiece? What makes it such an important film historically? It's no secret that Disney's Sleeping Beauty is considered by many to be a bit old-fashioned. You probably wouldn't see a film like it released today because the themes and plot are thought to be outdated by most modern audiences. Politics aside, the story would need several revisions to meet Hollywood's current standards of film etiquette. Hence why the live-action remake centered around Maleficent instead of Princess Aurora. For right now, we're just bringing up this fact for context, because even for its own day and age in 1959, Sleeping Beauty was already considered a little old-fashioned, and against the grain of films released in that era. At the time, fairy tales were considered quaint and childish to audiences, even if they weren't considered quite as antiquated as they are today. And yet, making a fairy tale was a conscious choice made by Walt Disney himself. So, why did Disney do it? Well, to Walt Disney, the story itself didn't matter as much as the way it was told. You see, Walt viewed animation not as a genre, but rather as an art form, a media in which to express creativity and imagination. He had found out long before that the simpler the story was, the greater potential there was for artistic display. If he could distill a plot down to its bare essentials, his team of storytellers and animators could fully develop those essentials for all that they were worth, streamlining and perfecting a story that could otherwise be complicated or convoluted. The more complicated a plot became, the more difficult it was for the studio artists to give it the well-rounded attention it deserved. A simple, even if old-fashioned plot allowed them to give every detail the attention it needed, without stretching themselves thin and trying to work on too much at once. What could be simpler than an antiquated fairy tale? And besides, Walt's biggest success at the time had been the princess archetype, with both Snow White and Cinderella starting and saving the studio respectively. Walt Disney wanted a film that was the pinnacle of his chosen art form. And in order to do that and still have it be successful, he needed to make a film that he knew he could pull off. He had perfected the art of adapting fairy tales and classic literature, with many of his films becoming the definitive versions of their respective tales, so he knew he could count on that again. In addition to that, Walt had quite a bit of practice in regards to princess stories and classical romances, so it was only natural that he would revisit the genre he had spent so long perfecting in order to produce his animation dream. So, even though traditional princess fairy tales might be a bad bet for today's filming landscape, they were actually quite bankable for Disney at the time, regardless of what critics of the 50s were saying, or what people say today. With a simplistic skeleton to build upon, Walt pushed forward full steam ahead on raising the bar of animation to a level that would never be met again. The story of Disney's Sleeping Beauty is incredibly minimalistic, even compared to other versions of the tale, and this is part of its brilliance. The entire story basically consists of an evil fairy cursing a child, everybody trying to prevent the curse from being fulfilled only for it to all be for naught when it comes to fruition, and then the desperate struggle to undo the curse once it's been done. There's a little more to it than that, but those are the bare bones of the plot, and every frame of the film works towards this goal. Not a single moment of the film is wasted on pointless or frivolous filler. Even what is considered comic relief has a direct bearing on the plot and moving it forward. For instance, the now famous pink versus blue segment of the film, where Flora and Merryweather bicker with magic in the cottage, while still providing levity and humor, also serves as a vehicle for Maleficent discovering where Aurora has been hiding, allowing her to be prepared for Aurora's eventual return to the castle, and for capturing Prince Philip later in the film. Every single detail in this film was methodically planned and executed with care, intentionally crafting a tight and memorable tale to serve as a backdrop for gorgeous animation and brilliant character execution. All of the characters in this film, whether intended to be humorous or serious, have been methodically whittled down to the essentials of what makes them important to the plot. And although some characters get far less attention than others, like Aurora herself for instance, each and every one of them has a clear and defined purpose which they fulfill expertly. There are no greater examples of this than the film's main vessels of good and evil.
Thinking you could defeat me, the mistress of all evil.
To explain what I mean, I'll start with the film's villain. Although she is by far one of the simplest villains in animation history, Maleficent is also one of the most memorable, gaining enough of a fan base to helm her own franchise. This is due to several factors, including the choice to not complicate her character. By making a clear distinction between good and evil, the studio wasn't bogged down by having to explain why Maleficent plots against our heroes, and instead could focus all of their attention on the means by which Maleficent carried out those plans, creating a far more interesting character in the visual sense. Instead of wasting time on backstory or the logic behind Maleficent's actions, the animator for Maleficent, the great Mark Davis, could now simply pour his talents into crafting a realistic and memorable performance. The result is a tour de force of Shakespearean poise and dignity, voiced to perfection by radio star Eleanor Audley. Mark Davis animated such subtlety into the character that you begin to forget that this is the same medium used to portray a goofy villain like Captain Hook or the zany citizens of Wonderland. She truly feels like a real character with presence and authority.
Don't you remember? We've met before. Once upon a dream.
As the film's portrayal of the most basic definition for the term good, Prince Philip is an excellent example for this visual medium. Although it's true that he is an example of the cliché Prince Charming archetype in its purest form, it serves the purpose of the streamlined story well. While we can argue the merits of Philip and Aurora meeting and falling in love in the same day, there is no denying that it cuts the story down to a more manageable runtime and allows more time in the story to be devoted to more visually engaging scenes. Whether the trade-off of a fully fleshed romance for a more visually engaging plot is worth it or not is completely up to you, and I'd be interested in hearing your opinions in the comments below. But it's not something we have time to talk about here. However, in my personal opinion, whatever credibility Prince Philip loses by falling in love with Aurora the first time they meet, is gained back when he literally faces lifelong imprisonment and the possibility of death at the hands of Maleficent in order to save the princess. He literally does everything in his power, up to laying down his life to prove that he loves her. This clear-cut definition of good versus evil, while not considered very original today, does provide an undeniable opportunity for a spectacular clash of ideals. Good and evil must face each other, and the film portrays that clash in an awe-inspiring feast for the eyes. The climax of the film, with Prince Philip's escape from Maleficent's dungeons to his eventual battle with Maleficent herself in dragon form, is a brilliant example of how the classical view of good versus evil benefited this animated masterpiece. Seeing the portrayal and execution of those archetypes to their fullest potential on screen was something that audiences had never seen before. In 1959, live-action filmmakers were limited by the technology available in regards to the amount of pure imagination that they could portray on screen, making these basic archetypes undesirable for story material. But in animation, both of these stereotypes could receive the visual representation that they needed, making clearly defined stereotypes an ideal starting point for design and a show-don't-tell mindset for story execution. The resulting film was a gorgeous work of art, utilizing the most prestigious and difficult animation techniques in the industry, proving that quality was more important than quantity when it came to entertainment.